Scotland, the evening of 10th May, 1941. The most extraordinary event of the Second World War is underway. Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, parachutes into a Scottish field. He has flown single-handed from Germany. He brings a plan for peace and expects to meet members of a British peace party eager to end the war. Instead, he is placed under arrest. Within hours, Hitler would denounce him as a madman. Both Churchill and Hitler would declare that he had acted alone. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, rarely photographed, never interviewed, never allowed to tell his story. Rudolf Hess would pass from history into mystery. The world would soon be stunned to hear that Hitler's deputy had flown from Germany with a peace proposal in his pocket. But for Rudolf Hess, this extraordinary mission was merely the final stage of a long journey, a journey that had begun 20 years earlier in a Germany decimated by defeat. The First World War left its mark on Hess. Like Hitler, he was wounded in the chest by a sniper's bullet, but recovered to train as a fighter pilot. After the war, he enrolled at Munich University. The city, like the rest of the once mighty Reich, was in crisis. The Versailles peace terms had humiliated Germany. Held responsible for war debts which it could never pay, the country fell into economic ruin. Inflation and disorder followed. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi for short, was the loudest voice against the Versailles settlement. Hess began to attend meetings where members raged against the traitors of Versailles, the Bolsheviks, and an economy run by the Jews. At one of these meetings, Hess first saw Hitler.
He first saw him on a rally in 1920, and he changed completely after first hearing Hitler. He was happy and told my mother that he had seen the man who is going to restore Germany's importance.
In 1923, with inflation running out of control and the fear of a communist uprising, Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich. With Hess and others, he marched into a city beer hall. Firing their revolvers into the roof, they announced that the revolution in Munich had begun. This beer hall putsch ended in shambles, and Hitler was arrested and imprisoned in the fortress of Landsberg. Hess escaped, but such was his bond with Hitler that he gave himself up and was sent to join him at Landsberg prison.
Hitler wrote during this period his book Mein Kampf, and he used my father as a devil's advocate. And in reading pieces of what he has written to my father and asking for his opinion.
One of Hess's most frequent prison visitors was Karl Haushofer, his professor from university days. Despite his having a Jewish wife, he and Hess became close friends. Haushofer had developed a new area of research which would focus on the relationship between people and the land in which they lived. He called it geopolitics. He asked whether the people of Germany had enough room to live, or Lebensraum. Hess had been entranced by this theory, which now found its way into Mein Kampf. After the war, Haushofer was interrogated by the Allies and asked if Hitler had learned his ideas of Lebensraum from Hess.
Those ideas certainly came from Hess to Hitler, but he didn't understand them. Whenever Hess tried to explain them to Hitler, Hitler would usually come up with one of his new ideas about an autobahn or anything that had nothing to do with it.
Isn't it true that Hess collaborated with Hitler in writing Mein Kampf?
As far as I know, Hess actually dictated many chapters of that book, yes.
The bond between Hitler and Hess was strengthened by their time in the Landsberg prison. From then until 1933, when President Hindenburg called on Hitler to form a government, and through the early years of Nazi rule, Hess was by the Führer's side, the conscience of the party.
He also played a key role at the Nuremberg rallies in welcoming Hitler. He built up the enthusiasm of the audience so that Hitler could be introduced at a time in which he could get maximum support.
Die Partei ist Hitler. Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist. Hitler, Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
The bond was not just political but personal. Hitler became godfather to Hess's son, named Wolf, after Hitler's own nickname during the early days of Nazism.
Rudolf Hess was of particular significance in the very early days because he was extremely close to Hitler as his bodyguard, as his secretary, and because he was regarded as totally loyal, Hitler gave him great responsibility and gave him the charge and control of the Nazi Party, which was a position of very considerable power within Germany at that time.
Haushofer's son Albrecht provided Hess with foreign intelligence ranging all over Europe and filing reports. Hess's foreign outlook was simple: peace with Britain, while Germany drove eastward to gain both Lebensraum and the destruction of Bolshevik Russia. The outbreak of war in 1939 shattered this dream. Britain was now the enemy, and Germany had signed a non-aggression pact with Russia. But Hitler was still set on destroying the Bolshevik demon. By 1941, he was ready. Hess was horrified at the prospect of a war on two fronts. If only Britain could be persuaded that peace was in her interest. He had reason to believe there was still a chance. A section of British society had gone to war reluctantly. Many landowners, together with financiers in the City of London, feared there would be no winners in this war. They reckoned that Britain and Germany would fight themselves to a standstill. The British Empire would disintegrate, leaving the military might of Russia and the industrial strength of the United States to dominate the world. To this exclusive social set, the great enemy was not Germany, but Bolshevik Russia.
Before the war, there was a very strong pro-German, pro-fascist, pro-Hitler movement in Britain, beginning right up the top with the Duke of Windsor, and including, two organizations, the Link, which had two dukes, the Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Westminster as members, and the Anglo-German Fellowship, which had people like, chairman of ICI, the chief policy advisor of the Foreign Office, and something like 15 or 16 peers of the realm belonging to it. So there was a strong pro-German peace movement in the British aristocracy, the British establishment.
Stalin's Russia was also seen as the main enemy by the British Secret Intelligence Service, or SIS. They too were keen to explore possibilities for peace.
SIS, the British Secret Intelligence Service, sometimes known as MI6, had before the war and after the war even started been making overtures to German dissident movements, one that didn't want to have Hitler in power anymore, others who thought it was an unnatural thing for Germany to be fighting an alliance of capitalists, Britain and later on the United States, and communism, and that the sooner that alliance could be broken, the better. So SIS were making all these peace moves with the Germans. A representative of SIS met a representative of Goering after the war had started in Switzerland. There were moves through the Vatican, there were moves in Sweden, there were all these little intrigues going on, largely led by SIS.
All of this gave Hess grounds for hope, but he needed a point of contact in Britain. By 1941, he believed he had found one. Hess had been seeking a point of contact in Britain, and by 1941 he believed he had found one in the Duke of Hamilton. The Duke was a wing commander in the Royal Air Force, leading a fighter wing based in Scotland and in charge of fighter defense for the area. He and his three brothers all commanded RAF squadrons. He had made history by being the first man to fly over Everest, and in his aerial exploits, Hess felt he had found a kindred spirit.
My father had fairly recently flown over Everest, which was over 29,000 feet. Hess had, in a slightly smaller way, won a thing called the Zugspitz race, which is the race around Germany's highest mountain, which is just short of 10,000 feet. And I think Hess felt that one of the advantages of going to see my father was that they would speak as man to man, pilot to pilot, about, I think in Hess's view, how the war might most satisfactorily be ended.
But it was more than mere flying skill that marked the Duke out. In October 1939, 1 month after the war had been declared, he had sent a letter to the Times in which he stated that the Versailles settlement had been unfair to Germany. He wrote, "I look forward to the day when a trusted Germany will again come into her own. That day may be far off, but when it comes, then hostilities could and should cease." This sympathy for the German people was underlined by his friendship with Karl Haushofer's son, Albrecht, who had stayed with him at his Scottish country castle, Dungavel House. Hess persuaded Haushofer to write to the Duke of Hamilton, urging a meeting in neutral Lisbon, but the letter was intercepted by the British Secret Service and never reached him. Haushofer warned that the time for a peace mission had passed, but a frustrated Hess felt it was now or never. By 1941, his flight plans were well advanced. He persuaded Willy Messerschmitt, his friend and Germany's top aircraft designer, to provide him with a brand new Me-110, a two-seater fighter-bomber that he would have to fly single-handed. Accompanied by Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer, he began to train on the aircraft.
He was a very keen pilot, and he won the so-called Zugspitzflug. And there's a telegram from Hitler saying, giving congratulations to him and saying, "I hope that your flying ambitions are now fulfilled." Because Hitler was not very fond of my father flying around.
At the same time, Hess's trusted aide Ernst Bohle translated a letter from Hess to the Duke of Hamilton into English. Interrogated after the war, Bohle was convinced that Hess was not planning his flight behind Hitler's back.
I hadn't the vaguest idea that he was flying to England. Otherwise, I would have told him it was a wild idea. And it was my firm opinion at the time, which I cannot prove to the one side or the other today, that Hitler knew all about it, because it seemed impossible to me that Hess would do anything of such importance without asking Hitler.
I'm convinced that Hitler and my father discussed this flight. My father always maintained that it was his personal idea, but there are a lot of indications that Hitler knew. For example, that they both talked on the 3rd of May, so very few days before the flight, together in Berlin, about 4 hours. No, we don't know what they talked, but we only know that the voices went up and down, and when they were finished, they came out of the room, and the police officer of my father who attended him told that Hitler had his arm around the shoulder of my father and said, "Hess, you have always been and will be a very stubborn man." So I don't believe that they were only talking about the weather.
On the morning of Saturday, May 10th, 1941, Hess said goodbye to Ilse and his 3-year-old son Wolf. He was going on a trip, but would be back on Monday. Around 6 o'clock, he took off from the field at Augsburg on a course that would pass over Hamilton's house at Dungavel in Scotland. His wife always claimed that behind him he left a letter for Hitler.
And if, my Führer, this project ends in failure, simply say, I was crazy.
His plane was equipped with long-range drop tanks to enable him to reach the northern coast of Britain, some 900 miles away. He flew at a very low level to avoid radar, but his aircraft was spotted by an observer post on the ground. How he avoided being shot down has become part of the Hess mystery. Several British fighters were scrambled to intercept and would have attacked had they made contact. Aware that he was being hunted and struggling to find his bearings, Hess knew that there was no alternative to bailing out. In a letter to his wife, Ilse, he relived the moment.
I unbuckled my harness, opened the canopy, and tried to climb out. It was impossible. The air pressure pressed me so hard against my seat that it was as if I had been welded to it. Of all the things I had innocently asked my fine Messerschmitt people, I had never once asked how to bail out. Then I remembered I had once heard that one must turn the plane upside down and fall out. I began to roll the plane over. Then everything turned black and I passed out. I was unconscious at the controls and racing towards the ground. I suddenly came round, as if by magic. I slid out. A split second later, the plane dropped like a stone. I pulled the parachute ripcord, the straps tightened, and I began to float. An indescribably wonderful and victorious feeling.
Hess had crashed to earth at Eaglesham in southern Scotland. In bailing out, he had struck the Messerschmitt's tail and chipped a bone in his ankle. And his welcoming party consisted not of leaders of the British establishment, but of local ploughman David McLean. As McLean helped Hess to his feet, he gave a false name, claiming to be Hauptmann Alfred Horn, but stressed that he had an important message for the Duke of Hamilton. Astonishingly, Hess was interviewed first not by the Army or Secret Service, but in a local scout hut by the Polish consul from Glasgow. They spoke in German, which no one else present understood. He was made to turn out his pockets, and a list was made of his possessions. These included a Leica camera, a map, photographs, and some visiting cards belonging to the Haushofers. There may also have been the letter to the Duke of Hamilton, which Bola had translated. We can only guess, as the list itself has disappeared. Still asking to see the Duke of Hamilton, Hess was taken to the local barracks. The next morning, Hamilton arrived to see him.
My father told me that soon as he got the information that a German pilot had crashed and given the name of Hauptmann Horn, he made arrangements to go across with an interrogating officer to see him in Maryhill Barracks the next morning, which he did. And when he entered the room, the German, who was then in bed with a chipped ankle, because he'd broken his ankle on landing, asked to see him alone. And the interrogating officer withdrew, and he said to my father, "I don't know whether you know who I am, but my name is Rudolf Hess. I'm Hitler's deputy, and I'm here on a personal, unauthorized mission of humanity." And he then went on to explain that the peace offer he was making was a free hand to Britain in the empire, provided only that Germany should have a free hand in Europe and the East.
Hamilton left to visit the crash site and then returned to his house on the airfield.
My father came home and he was in a state of some excitement, and he said he couldn't stay long because a nasty Nazi had landed fairly nearby, and he was going to go and see the nasty Nazi and also his aeroplane. So he left with me calling after him, "Bring me back a bit of aeroplane, please, Daddy." And he did. He said he would, and he did. And it's here. And I was really very upset about it because I was expecting to get a nice big tail fin with a swastika on it or something of the sort. However, I made the best of it. And about 2 days later, two sort of archetypal Secret Service men turned up wearing those funny trilby hats and odd, I remember them very distinctly, odd raincoats with the splits up the back. And they said, "What are you doing with this piece of equipment?" And I said, "My daddy gave it to me and it belonged to a Nazi. And they said, "Well, you've no business to have it, it's not yours." And they took it away.
Hamilton then immediately set off to report to Churchill, flying down in his own Hurricane fighter plane.
When he arrived, he was greeted by Winston Churchill in tremendous spirits because 33 German bombers had been shot down the night before. And he was asked for his news about 30 people attending the dinner. And he said, "I would rather tell you alone." So the 30 withdrew next door, leaving only Archie Sinclair, who was Minister for the Royal Air Force, and Sir Winston Churchill. And my father told him his story. And Churchill said, "Do you mean